clearly, Vitalik is known in this crowd, the visionary behind Ethereum, and also very happy to be talking with you because you put together a policy which has helped inspire this one here at Vitalik. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you guys too for actually doing it.
Yeah, so we're just gonna start out with a few questions. Mostly leave time for you guys to think of your questions and what you would like. One question on my mind is, there's been some myths about the start of Zuzalu and the name. Some people, for example, have this maybe urban legend that you chat GPTs. What's a word that doesn't have a meaning in any language? Is that true, or is there a different story that's actually true about the name?
That is indeed what I just kept on looking through names that don't mean anything, of which the bots generated a lot until I found one I liked.
All right, awesome. That's and also, do you mind if we record?
You may absolutely record. And you may feel free to blast it out as interstellar space descent to the aliens. So I doubt that, they especially here yet. But, maybe they'll care about us in 100 years or a million. It'll be fun.
Good. I think it's okay.
We have recording now.
Here, keep the question for a minute.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Vitalik. Thank you so much for attending the call. Well, I guess this is the one of the calls in the conference. But really appreciate it. So, first and foremost, you mind me asking, what is your connection between your work with Ethereum and how does it relate to new jurisdictions or new communities more generally?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of this that are really important. Basically, one of them is crypto as infrastructure, and the other is crypto as community, right? So on the crypto as infrastructure side, it's pretty simple, right? That if a new community wants to have infrastructure that is sovereign, that is not dependent on any any one specific outside actor, which are things that lots of even existing jurisdictions want. Then blockchains are just a great way to do that, right? And you basically just immediately get plugged into this very powerful network for global finance, increasingly. Also, more and more things outside of finance having to do with identity-related things and making attestations and proofs about yourself, and do naming systems and things like this. And these are all pieces that are very useful, and I think especially for people that are kind of outside of traditional systems of, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to be outside of traditional systems, right? There's a lot of different countries that are not well served by them. There's a lot of, people who are just doing things that are outside the norm, and they often, even if those things are perfectly, completely legal, I think there was this interesting book by Bruce Steyer called Liars and Outliers, where he basically mentioned that a lot of kind of default methods by which the mainstream kind of weeds out the bad guys also just ends up weeding out just any kind of weird people in general, including weird people that are doing super important things. And if the community is like Vitalia in a lot of cases, if you can make your connection to the world, whether that's financial or otherwise, less dependent on which particular country you're in, that gives you a lot more freedom and options in terms of where to be based and potentially when to change the base and things like that. So I think there's a lot of spiritual ties and a lot of common values, and also a lot of practical applications as well. On the community side, I think like crypto has managed to bring together a large group of people who care about like very similar topics and care about very similar values, and also an extremely international community. There's this analysis of who the crypto developers are, and that I linked to in my latest blog, and there's like 74% of them outside of the US. And if you just do a basic tally of we are the top 10 most interesting people, however you define that in crypto are, and compare that versus AI, for example, the difference is super stark, right? And people who are interested in things like new jurisdictions, I think often care about similar things. They're often trying to do something that is very valuable for humanity, but also very weird. And I think there's a pretty easy kind of tie-in just on on this kind of very intuitive vibe level between those two things, which is why I think we've seen a very high overlap between those two communities so far. And when there's already an already formed community with already formed relationships, then it can easily I think expand from one area to another.
So on that weirdness, in the outliers, both jurisdictions and crypto communities and decentralized ledgers, they don't operate tabula rasa as many as initially thought. They have to tie a line between existing institutions and what's possible versus the ideals, and you have to play a calculus very frequently. And you're doing that a lot with, it seems like, privacy and identity and what have you. What's the calculus that you have in your head? I know it's dependent on certain circumstances, but in general, do you have any principles for determining when you lean more into values and when you lean more into compromise to work with existing institutions?
I mean, I think there's three kinds of compromise that are important here, right? I mean, one is not literally getting bombed and killed, right? And this was the thing that kind of people, traditional political philosophers think of nation states as being about, right? And basically, in some cases, the more far out you go in terms of the things you do, the harder it is to find a place where that's reliably doesn't happen to you, right? And that's also true for political dissidents, true for even LGBTQ people, for a lot of different categories. But then I think a lot of people started with that framing, but there's also these two other framings that are important, where even if each and every one of us had a kind of physical invincibility shield, that would not kind of take away our need to think about these things. One of them is being in order to be able to benefit from just network effects of existing institutions, technologies, and infrastructure. And the third is not actually compromising with institutions, but compromising with people in their capacity as end users, right? And this is also one that a lot of I think people in crypto are recently thinking about. I mean, a lot of discussion in Ethereum, right, about how Ethereum and its layer 2 ecosystem just need to improve their user experience in order because if they don't, then the things that succeed are going to be half centralized or even full centralized things that are just shuttling USDT around, and it'll have the label of crypto, but it won't really actually be crypto in almost any meaningful sense. So trying to create that line between making sure that things like openness and security and just free entry and privacy and all those things are preserved, and just being usable enough by regular users is one of those challenges in crypto that's very top of the line. And I think in the kind of radical longevity space, there's like obvious natural parallels for this, right? Like the one that comes to mind is obviously, the Brian Johnson kind of millions of dollars a year blueprint menu, where on the one hand it's like, super amazing that like that kind of top of the line research is happening, but like on the other hand, most people don't have $2 billion a year, and so there's like also this market niche for sort of blueprints for the everyman, and like trying to see, what is the projection of like those ideas onto what someone can do with, living in a fairly normal or even lower infrastructure city on 15 minutes a day and $15 a day, or 30 minutes a day and $30 a day, or whatever your budget is, and that's. That feels like a kind of spiritually similar kind of compromise, but it's the sort of thing that's really valuable to do. And then the third one is institutions and being able to work with network effects, right? So I think on the crypto side, I mean, the big one of this is obviously the whole privacy conversation, right? Where and so, on the one hand, we've been seeing developers start to get arrested in a couple of places, and those are the high-profile stories. But on the other hand, it's even if exactly none of that happened, eventually the system would fall into an equilibrium where none of the coins that came out of a privacy system would just be accepted by a mainstream banking system because they'd be treated as suspect by default. And so if you can instead come up with clever privacy solutions to let you also not prove that you're not one of these a major DeFi hacker, for example, or a thief, then the set of people that you're offending becomes much lower, and you still do have quite a bit of legal room to enable privacy for people trying to do a lot of very weird things, and even things that go against the interests of a lot of established institutions. But at the same time, it's one of those balancing games where if you overstretch, then kind of the entire thing ends up by sort of getting kind of ostracized and blackballed. But if you find the right line, then you actually can make significant difference. And I guess the equivalent in jurisdictions, for example, is one of the big ones is the idea of countries doing economic citizenship passports and giving out passports, which is something that I'm super in favor of, right? Because I'm from a country where lots of people for a very good reason wants to leave, and where lots of I know lots of have lots of friends from actually various other countries where such a thing is similar to their sense. But one thing that's common about those places is that by default they're not very you have a hard time going into most of the rest of the world, and so this is why in principle I'm a big fan of all of these kind of pay a few $100,000 to get a passport sort of programs, and I fully recognize that they're only available to millionaires and all of that, but to me it's solving 1% of the problem is much better than solving 0%, and often you need those people to sometimes be a kind of a jumping off point there and build the rest of the community. But then the challenge, of course, is that if we're seeing these programs start to get more restrictive over time, and if a country is kind of too open about one and what kinds of people they accept, then the quality of the citizen of a country in the eyes of other countries just ends up going down a lot, right? And that basically it will the risk to a country is you end up actually losing visa-free status to a lot of places. So I think interesting compromise approaches on that whole topic are something that's also super worth exploring, right? And they even think that things like crypto reputation systems, could even end up being part of that. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of very similar issues and tie-ins there.
Very cool. But before we open up to audience questions, just one more question. So we just talked about how you think that Ethereum and other people in other jurisdictions and startup society should engage with outside stakeholders. But you're in a unique position, other people in the blockchain space of internal dynamics and internal stakeholders. And I know that Ethereum is a decentralized ecosystem, but in a sense you're kind of a symbolic head of network state. So you often have to deal with the internal governance of the Ethereum ecosystem. And when you've done that, I'm sure there's been times when stakeholders have disagreed about certain things. When you're in that type of scenario, what are principles that you do in order to reduce disputes and to lead to cooperation and constructive solutions?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons that I learned about this whole topic over the last 10 years is that I think 20% of the problem is in the actual formal decision or voting mechanism or whatever. And 80% of the problem is in the communication structure that leads up to that final decision. So, in one, just simple example of this is just that understanding and knowing the right time to introduce different ideas, especially if they're new and speculative and you yourself are not even fully confident in them, right? One of the reasons why Ethereum managed to switch to proof of stake, I think, so smoothly from a social standpoint is that it was something that's been talked about as a goal all the way back since 2014. And Ethereum has this interesting property where the roadmap essentially functions as a constitution, except traditional constitutions are, they're unchanging documents meant to describe an unchanging present reality. They're basically saying, these are things that we like, and there's no way in how they're going to take them away from us. But the roadmap is a document that's saying this is what we're building towards, right? And so the existence of that basically means that sometimes change can have greater legitimacy than no change. And I think for any kind of community pursuing radical technology, having that style of constitution or roadmap or whatever you call it is definitely something that's super valuable, right? Basically, a lot of the time, disagreements are always going to pop up because unknown unknowns pop up, and the landscape changes in all kinds of ways, and new ideas even pop up. But the more that there just has been published about and already widely talked about what to do with various contingencies, the less the chance that some new decision will totally blindside people. I think the thing that you want to really avoid is these kind of preference falsification situations. This is one of those things that I think happened in the DAO fork to some extent, where I think a lot of people felt mistreated basically because a lot of the supporters of the fork were sort of acting like the level of support was higher than it actually is. And a lot of it, discourse going around basically, saying that if you oppose the thing, then you're a bad person, which is totally not true, right? But often when a bubble forms around one of those things, then it just ends up self-reinforcing because people interpret silence as consent when the silence is actually fear, then you sometimes you see something being proposed and then it just actually totally and completely failing. And the DAO fork did actually succeed, right? And I think one of the things that helped was that before we did the fork, we did those votes, right? And there were social media votes, there were each stakeholder, each holder votes, there were a couple of others that showed about an 85% support level. But if those did not exist, that would have been even way more chaotic, and even a chance that it might have totally collapsed. The OpenAI situation comes to mind as one where things that kind of went off the rails even more, right? And like to me, I think the story there is like basically people undervaluing sort of broader democratic legitimacy, right? Like basically people thought that like the game was, the official rules of the game and the CEO and the board and like all the kind of, written down politics of like who's allowed to do what there. But the actual game was that, like as the famous line goes, like opening eyes, nothing without its people, right? And yeah, like I think there's basically this kind of like failure to recognize the larger game causes a lot of problems. And so I think in Ethereum, there's often this very explicit effort to try to recognize some of those larger games. They often even kind of do decision making or even kind of like reaching the process of making a decision in such a way that the ideas are kind of flowing around and discussed, and the trade-offs are understood for a long time, even from like that perspective first, right? Like there's like basically nothing just kind of like comes out of the full developer space so that gets like forced on a community and really blindsides people, right? It's like so far it's pretty much always been ideas that were already pre-discussed for a while. So I think there's like lots of things that you can do in order to have just like better communication structure. I'm also excited about like some of these like ZK forums and Z polls and things like that for the same reason, right? Because like I think you can often prevent one of these like preference falsification cascades if you give people the ability to like disagree with no personal risk. So it would be interesting to see how things like that end up going. So yeah.
Perfect. And speaking of engaging the community, I'm sure everyone here is absolutely itching for questions. So let's start with that. Thank you, Vitalik. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So we got Lawrence here first.
Happy birthday, Vitalik, first of all. I wish you would have been here in person a few days ago when it was your birthday. And I hope we can celebrate your next many birthdays, thousands hopefully, together in Vitalia. So we actually decided to extend our housing until April 1st in the district here in Prospera, and have a permanent district here. So hopefully one of your next birthdays will be here, or even you can make it in the next 1 or 2 months. I would love to also explore with you governance more. So we actually decided to use the funds that would come through the Gitcoin round you donated to for these 4 cities to have an initial treasury for the community to decide on. So how should the community decide on how to spend that money? How do you see governance for Zuzalu and Vitalia? Any advice?
I couldn't hear the last sentence.
How do you see governance? Do you have any advice on governance for Zuzalu, for Vitalia? How do you think about these things?
So is the question just like, how do I see governance for Zuzalu and Vitalia and things like this?
Yeah. Any advice on these things? Yeah, you might actually only hear questions when they're here next to the mic.
Oh yeah. Wow.
So people, if you want to actually ask questions, you have to line up here, and so you ask them next to the microphone.
Yeah, how do I see governance? I think like any discussion on governance has to be started by pointing out that governance is 20%, communication is 80%, but I already said that. I think the other three ingredients that you need is you need a concept of membership, right? Like you need some kind of clear idea of who's inside and who's outside. And that does not need to be a binary, right? Like you can have membership coefficients, the numbers between 0 and 1 or numbers between 0 and infinity or whatever. And I think that's actually, extremely healthy and fine as well. Like people who contribute a little bit should be, recognized more than people who contribute 0 but less than people who have, been there full time since the beginning. Then, in terms of Sure. I mean, I think within the crypto space, like one of the really major dimensions is the whole sort of idealistic versus pragmatic, which kind of maps onto like decentralized versus centralized kind of governance structure, right? Like, to what extent the sort of directors like even exist, right? And the way that I think about this is like basically mapping it onto my context versus concave framework. Like basically, are you operating in a decision space where like a compromise between the two decisions, like the split down the middle, whatever that means, is that better than flipping a coin between the two, or is that worse than flipping a coin between the two, right? And there's like obvious like just like examples everywhere in real life of both, right? Like if you look at like tax rates, for example, right? Like there's a lot of economic math about how the like as you keep increasing taxes, the amount of tax revenue you gain from each additional percent goes down, but then the amount of like economic inefficiency you cause from each additional percent goes up. And so, like it's like the curve of good stuff just kind of like does this, right? And the curve of bad stuff like does this. And so with that, like it just logically follows that 25% is better than a coin flip between 10% and 40%. And then on the other side, like if you're like deciding like which planets to colonize, then a lot, and you have very limited resources, then like it might make sense to like only choose, like either go to the moon or go to Mars instead of like making a weird and like half-hearted effort to like send like half the crew toward both, and like actually not being enough or not having enough resources on each one to be self-sustaining, right? So both exist, and like I think when you're in the concave regime, where the regime where compromises are better, then like often you basically don't even like need kind of individuals as leaders. You basically need some kind of like the ability to vote and a strong intellectual ecosystem. But then when you have these kind of more convex situations, then like you do need some like way to quickly coordinate the group toward like one or the other concrete decision. And often like the decision that's being made is not even one specific act. It's like a complicated strategy, which just kind of inevitably, at least to some extent, only exists in a few people's heads. And so in those kinds of situations, like the kind of structure that I like from a very high level perspective is like what I think like that's what people have called, it might have even been like courtesy art and talking about the hourglass structure, where basically you have the kind of accountability, like decentralized accountability layer at the top, centralized kind of decision-making layer in the middle, and then decentralized execution layer at the bottom, right? And so you have like two kinds of decentralization. Like at the bottom, it's like every actor has like is given their objective, but is given freedom to interpret their objective. And like this is something that even militaries do, right? Like in militaries, that's like a thing that you're given orders, but it's like bad if the orders are too detailed, because the people implementing them are the ones that have local context. And then you have the accountability layer at the top, which is basically there to kind of prevent the crazy dictator problem. But in a lot of ways, like the hourglass is how a lot of things in the world work already, right? Like if you look at corporations, lots of employees, lots of shareholders, like one CEO, and then sort of middle of the hourglass, you have the board intermediating between the CEO and the shareholders, and then at the bottom you have managers intermediating between the CEO and the employees. So in practice, of course, shareholders are not super decentralized these days. Like even that democracy works this way in principle, right? If people vote, people elect the government. Government has a civil service. So that's and then the question is like within that outline, like what actually is the kind of implementation process? What is the accountability process? Like how do you maximize that autonomy? Like how do you do votes and so forth? Like that's up to To me, that's up to experimentation. Like, I don't think we're at the point yet where we have like some practices that are obviously better than all the others.
A lot more to dive into there. Hope you can come.
Hey, Doc. John Bliss from Gavin here. Question about Ethereum and network states. Given that Ethereum is literally a state machine managed by a network, is a blockchain leviathan that can't be controlled by existing nation states, and in the sense of seeing like a state is a legible record of identity, does Ethereum already qualify as a functioning network state?
That's a fun question. I mean, I want to say no because I feel like at least the concept of a network state as it's been talked about so far, it's kind of like thicker than a blockchain, like thicker in the sense of appealing to fewer people, but like actually demanding more of each person, right? Like blockchains are like infrastructure that like lots of people from all kinds of different places in the world can use, who in a lot of cases otherwise just literally can't relate to each other, right? And though at the same time, there definitely is such a thing as a kind of core Ethereum community, whereas network states kind of come from the other direction and basically saying like start with something that's smaller and make sure that it's more aligned, but then like from the beginning, actually like demand more radical lifestyle changes from each individual member, right? Like you can actually move to a pod, it's like in Ethereum, it's like the medium end of contribution is regularly being on internet forums. In a network state, the low end of contribution is regularly being on internet forums, right? And the medium end of contribution is like, go live in a pod, right? So network states go live in a pod, Ethereum, I guess, eat the bugs, at least. So these days, the bugs have all mostly been fixed so far. And we're also getting better and better at actually having privacy. So I think the role for Ethereum to play here, or maybe I should say the Ethereum community in particular, is like it's kind of like a much thinner sort of like wrapping layer that's in a very informal way, right? So some analogies that I think about, right? Like if you try to think about the analogy of network states as being like countries, like what are some like supranational institutions that you have, right? One, for example, is like NATO, right? Like a pretty committed defensive alliance. Another is like the European Union, right? Which goes a lot further in all kinds of economic integration. A third is the West, right? Which is not even an institution, and it's like this, like very weird kind of thing where people often even have conflicting definitions of it, and like people disagree whether or not Honduras is part of it. People disagree whether or not Japan is part of it, for example. Then you have the UN, which is sort of like maximally expansive, or close to maximally expansive, but still excludes about 0.5% of the world, I think. But on the other hand, it's like pretty thin, and countries that are like literally at war with each other can just like continue to be part of it, and like that's considered normal. So the question is like, which of those does the Ethereum community map to? And I kind of want to say the West is like probably the better analogy out of like at least the four that I've listed so far, right? But I think in general, like that's the question that you want to ask, right? It's like once there's enough of these network states that there is actually room for these cross layers, then like what is the function of the cross layers, and like where are they on the spectrum of trade-offs between kind of how inclusive they are versus how demanding they and therefore at the same time kind of like how value providing they are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. So actually, if I can suggest a funny answer to the funny question, I'll say maybe like Ethereum is a stateless state machine, but it's with different meanings of it. So I would like to discuss like governance, but on the outside, meaning that with the fact that Zuzalu now is kind of like creating a lot of spin-off, we'll have this overarching structure that Zuzalu could have been. How do you envision, or what are suggestions for the manner in which those different spin-offs can organize themselves or coordinate themselves into some kind of structure that doesn't require indeed the existence or the formation of some overarching infrastructure, but nonetheless do not exist separately, because otherwise there leads to just like a fragmentation with a lot of little spin-offs that are not perceived as potentially being part of a broader movement.
So is the question kind of summarized to just like how these different spin-offs can continue to like cooperate and like share things with each other without creating some kind of overarching superorg?
Yeah, like basically, what is the if you have a vision for like an inter governance between those different spin-offs, so that they nonetheless become more powerful or more impactful if they are perceived as something that acts, that collective action can be collective amongst those individuals, and also with regard to legitimacy, it is easier, for instance, if they want to interface with state actor. If it's like a small entity, it might be much harder than if it's like a network of entities.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think, very similar to the previous question in a lot of ways, right? I think the challenge, like, one of the big axes for me here is like how formal versus like how informal, like whatever the connection is. And like, I think you're right that like leaning toward the informal side is much better. Like, I think the place where there is value for a formal thing to me is like digital public infrastructure, right? So like, you have the various ZooPass stuff. If you have Zuzalu, potentially, we'll have, obviously, the Ethereum network and everything that lives on it, some other identity-related technologies in the future. Potentially kind of guides for best practices to give something that's kind of, a little like less computery, but still important, right? So, trying to have like explicit organizations for those things is probably the thing that makes sense. But I think on the informal side, there's a lot of precedents for informal cooperation, working well in various ways, right? One. In Japan, there's this concept of keiretsus, right? Like basically, like large corporations that have cross ownership with each other and that have like various kinds of links with each other, and so they end up kind of cooperating much more than they would if it was like much more of an each company for itself sort of situation. And like I think for that, like the keiretsu example, like people sometimes criticize it for like basically being kind of too close to being a cartel and like sacrificing dynamism and those things. But I think in this case, like we're just so far away from that, right? Because it's still like it's much more of a small fish in a big pond situation than like like a big fish in a medium pond kind of a situation as it is there. So I, like for example, I would just support there being a culture of like everyone who participates in even one of these participating at least a little in some other one that's like a little bit distant. I would support even like the leadership of one, whether that's kind of de jure or de facto. Like I think there's just lots of different ways to become a leader in one of these communities, even without having a position. But like I think for them, it's also especially valuable to kind of visit these other bubbles and maintain those cross connections between them. And I think like when those cross connections exist just on a on a pure social level, and then when you have like the shared digital infrastructure at the same time, and so you're also talking to each other on the internet, then you're like people understand each other's goals more, and it's also like harder to, or it's easier to like be supportive of each other, and harder to like completely abandon each other when like you actually like have those links available. So I think that's like probably the place to start with for cooperation, and then as these things start growing and entering more challenges, then I think like that can organically expand from there. But there's definitely no need to kind of like overdo the formal links at the beginning.
Thank you.
Hi Vitalik, it's Keith from Lifespan.io, the Life Extension Advocacy Foundation. My question is a little bit more on the technical side. When dealing with governmental health agencies and policymakers, etc., it's been very challenging explaining how blockchain technology can be instrumental in managing, sharing, and operating on healthcare data in a more standardized, useful, and privacy-preserving way. So I was curious if you have any thoughts on what you think would be the easiest and smallest, logistically speaking, types of projects communities like Vitalia can create that can really demonstrate this value proposition in an easily understandable and undeniable way that can catalyze changes beyond communities such as Vitalia.
Sure. So I think, two answers, right? I mean, one is that the main like demonstrated value out of blockchains is funding strategies, right? And like we're seeing NFTs, like we're seeing coins of various kinds, and all of those things. But I think in addition, it's this is also part of why, like especially for some of these sort of more mainstreamy applications, I've been like relatively reducing emphasis on blockchains and increasing emphasis on zero-knowledge proofs, which are increasingly the other big pillar of crypto, right? And zero-knowledge proofs, like they provide, I think, a huge amount of value in the healthcare context, because the healthcare context is a very privacy-demanding context, and so it's exactly the kind of case where you want to have as much you want these kinds of technologies that can like do verification and preserve privacy at the same time. In particular, the whole concept of like tracking, right, and like basically collecting people's bio data 24/7, and using that as input into all kinds of things. Like it's like the sort of thing that like from a researcher's perspective is like utopia, but from the perspective of like anyone who is weird or has any reason to fear an establishment is like the ultimate dystopia. And so I think wrapping a lot of that data collection in a zero-knowledge proof layer actually lets us sidestep a lot of the privacy concerns and basically get the best of both at the same time.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. So I agree with you. So I'm just curious, do you think like what's the most microcosmic example in terms of like a type of data set where that value, where we can prove to the public and policymakers that, hey, we can get these benefits while preserving privacy and not spook everybody out? Because exactly what you just said, when I have these conversations, because they don't readily understand zero-knowledge proofs, everyone goes right to the dystopia and doesn't understand how these technologies can help. So is there like a simple, using like say WorldCoin as like a perception negative example, right? Is there something else, that we could do?
Okay, a public decentralized trial where like you try to scale it up and you make it available to people online instead of just inside of Vitalia. Thousands of people. And you do the thing where you kind of randomly assign them to like either take different pills and then you mail it to them and it's double blind, or just like have some different set of activities or whatever. And then you like have them like wear watches that just like collect all the data about their lives 24/7. And to protect people's privacy, like your basic, when the data gets sent, it gets wrapped in a zero-knowledge proof layer, which where one part of that is just like authenticating them to show and like proving that they have a right to participate without actually revealing what their specific ID is. And then the second layer of that might even be like re-randomizing that ID like once every unit of time, but still keeping track which of the two groups a person is in, just to kind of like protect people's like lifestyle trajectories, privacy even further.
Got it. Great. We're actually working on a decentralized trial very much along those lines, so I appreciate that input. We'd be happy to dig into it if you join us here. But thanks, Vitalik. Happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you.